Robin Hood Radio and the Robin Hood Radio Network is proud to present Leonard Lopate at Large, lively hour-long in-depth discussions providing overviews and context to topics usually covered in partial measures. His guests include leading thinkers, scientists, artists, economists, farmers, historians, authors, and politicians. Mr. Lopate is a Peabody Award winner whose numerous honors include 3 Associated Press Awards and 3 James Beard Awards.
Welcome to Leonard Lopate at Large. I'm Leonard Lopate. In recent years, several new city parks like the High Line and Brooklyn Bridge Park have been created to great acclaim, but there's also been some controversy. For example, a new park being planned for the Hudson Yards project in Manhattan's West Side is slated to cost $374 million, more than $124 million per acre. Why should creating a new park cost that much? And why does it sometimes seem that wealthier areas have more parks than poorer neighborhoods and that they're better maintained? I have invited Adrian Benepe, the former commissioner of New York City's Department of Parks and Recreation and currently the senior vice president and director of city park development at the Trust for Public Land, to our show now to talk about that and other issues relating to the city's green spaces. Welcome.
It's great to be with you, Leonard.
You were, as I said, New York City Parks Commissioner from 2002 to 2012. Have things changed much in the Parks Department since you left?
You know, I have a national job now, so I spend a lot of time visiting cities and parks outside of New York and don't pay quite as much attention to local parks as I used to. But I would say that, parks continue to be a very important thing for New Yorkers, and I think very highly of Mitchell Silver, the Parks Commissioner.
It seems like more new parks have been created in New York City in the last decade or so than in the years before that. Is that actually the case, or is it just been a matter of getting more press?
No, it's actually been the case. We're currently living in kind of a golden age of park creation, not just in New York, but across the nation.
And New York parks have influenced parks across the rest of the country.
Very much. New York City parks have been a bellwether for park creation, design, innovation, management since parks were invented, going back really to the creation of Central Park.
And Prospect Park, I imagine. Now you see High Lines everywhere.
Oh, yeah, the High Line has spawned many imitators. In fact, I just saw a great new one that just opened in San Francisco, Salesforce Park. It's on top of their bus terminal. It's as if you put a 6-acre park on top of the Port Authority bus terminal.
Were some of these parks, like Hudson River Park, the High Line, and Brooklyn Bridge Park, built while you were Parks Commissioner?
Oh, very much so. I was very fortunate that my tenure as Parks Commissioner coincided with the tenure of Michael Bloomberg as mayor, because he was very pro-parks, thought that parks were important for cities, and was willing to put untold amounts of public dollars, not his own dollars, but public dollars into them. We had $6 billion over 12 years. That's $500 million a year just on the capital side for building new parks. So, yeah, there was a big flourishing of parks under Mayor Bloomberg.
And did he initiate them, or did you, or did the department, or somebody else?
Some we and he initiated. Some he was carrying on the work of predecessors. It would come as a surprise probably to you and your listeners that 2 of the most important new parks really got their big starts under Mayor Giuliani and Governor Pataki. So Brooklyn Bridge Park, that agreement was signed by Pataki and Giuliani. And then same thing with Hudson River Park, with other players, of course. So interestingly, the most park supportive governor of recent years was Pataki, who was a very progressive Republican, but very into land conservation and parks.
You were also there for the restoration of Central Park and Battery Park. Does the city foot the whole bill for that?
Absolutely not, no. And that's the other thing, that the park system in New York City has been a sort of crucible of invention. The idea of a park conservancy was born in New York City, has since spread across the country. There are now more than 100 conservancies for parks in cities across the country. But it was really the Central Park Conservancy, the Prospect Park Alliance, the Battery Conservancy, Friends of the High Line. Those got this started, and now they've been copied all across the country. And in fact, the Central Park Conservancy and the High Line have institutes that teach other cities how to do this kind of stuff.
And who created those things?
So
just local concerned wealthy citizens?
Actually not. This is pretty funny. Not local and not wealthy. I call them the Wonder Women of parks. A woman named Betsy Barlow invented the concept of the Central Park Conservancy. She was from San Antonio. A woman named Maury Price invented the battery Conservancy. She was also from San Antonio. Robert Hammond, who was one of the co-creators of the High Line, was from San Antonio. So a lot of out-of-towners invented this model. Tupper Thomas from Minneapolis. So actually, I think it was because they were out-of-towners. They were kind of Pollyanna-ish, polite, wouldn't take no for an answer, internally optimistic, and willing to try new models, and were not afraid of City Hall.
So what are conservancies? Are they non-profit organizations that raise funds to help maintain parks?
They can vary. Sometimes they're doing maintenance and operations, sometimes capital projects, sometimes programming, and they vary according. And there's some are very big and very lavishly funded. Some are very small and kind of grassroots. My favorite one is not called a conservancy, but it is. It's called the Bronx River Alliance, and that's a sort of consortium of environmental justice groups that, even though there isn't a lot of private money in that community, they were able to put together close to $200 million in mostly public money. So you have beautiful parks now along the Bronx River.
So parks in wealthier neighborhoods are not necessarily more likely to have conservancies than the ones in poorer areas?
No, they are. And that's the dividing line. The conservancies tend to be in wealthy neighborhoods because that's where the money is. So it's easy to raise money in wealthy neighborhoods. But my view has been that having a conservancy for Central Park or Prospect Park allows the city to spend its scarce public dollars on parks that don't have conservancies. And if you think about Central Park, the conservancy raises probably $30 million a year in private funds. It pays for 85% of the maintenance of the park. It does get some money from the city. That means the city isn't spending $30 million in public dollars on the park.
And when you say maintenance of the park, are we talking about picking up garbage, or are we talking about trimming trees, getting rid of weeds?
Every bit of it. The entire maintenance burden in Central Park, the picking up the litter, the mowing the lawn, taking care of the trees, cleaning the monuments, it's all paid for and run by a nonprofit organization.
Hudson River Park has two groups. It has Friends of Hudson River Park and Hudson River Park Trust. Do they work together?
Absolutely. So the Hudson River Park Trust is a quasi-governmental organization. So Brooklyn Bridge and Hudson River, because they are state-city partnerships, have governing bodies that are mostly governmental, that are named by government agencies and chaired by people named by government officials. And they have the responsibility for building and maintaining the parks. Each one has a conservancy that raises money for programming and other things there. But the big money for both those parks came from the public sector. It's $500 million each, virtually all of it public dollars.
City Parks Foundation, Partnership for Parks, New Yorkers for Parks?
City Parks Foundation, again, these are different. Those are not conservancies. City Parks Foundation does programming and sports and arts, primarily focused on underserved neighborhoods. It's a terrific organization. They do the Central Park Summer Stage. They do concerts in the parks. New Yorkers for Parks is an advocacy organization. They don't build parks. They don't maintain parks. They advocate for parks. They go to City Hall and say, increase the budget. They are working to try to save Marx Brothers Playground. So they're very much sort of a political advocacy group for all parks in New York.
As you mentioned earlier, you're now the Director of City Park Development for the Trust for Public Land. What does the Trust for Public Land do, and what's your role in it?
That's what we call the softball question. Thank you. The Trust for Public Land is...
Well, I assume you know the answer.
I just pulled a string in my back. Remember the dolls? You pull the string in the back, it talks. The Trust for Public Land is a nonprofit organization. It's national, and we're working to save land for public purposes, and that includes making and helping to make parks in cities and protecting large swaths of land in rural areas. And the whole idea is we don't own or maintain anything. We want to put land into public hands. And our main goal is that every resident of every city and town in America should have a quality park within a 10-minute walk.
You grew up in New York. Was there a quality park near you?
Oh, you better believe it. I've always lived near Riverside Park, which let's put it this way. All the parks went through very bad times, you remember, in the 60s and 70s. But, that was my neighborhood park, Central Park, and there were also some playgrounds.
Many people have mostly negative things to say about Robert Moses, but he gave us Riverside Park.
He absolutely did. And, I think people in the parks business don't say negative things about Moses because everything he did on the park side was positive. You can argue about whether if he hadn't built the highways to the Bronx, someone else would have. And I think that's a legitimate argument.
Well, but he destroyed. Well, we won't get into the Robert Moses.
But somebody would have run a highway between the George Washington Bridge and Boston. It's just a matter of which neighborhood got destroyed.
The trust has created a ranking system for cities with regard to parks. What are they measuring?
So we have a number of different measures. For the 100 largest cities, we have something called Park Score, and that's how we rank cities as to how well they provide parks. And we look at 5 basic metrics. One is what percentage of the city is dedicated to parkland. Then we look at the median park size. The most important thing we look at, I think, is how many people live within a 10-minute walk of a park. Then we look at what's the level of public and private investment in the park system, and then what kinds of amenities are present. So things like swimming pools, splash pads, basketball hoops, the things you'd look for in a quality park. We add those all up, and then we rank the cities as to how well they do. And do you want to know who's number 1 park city in America?
Of course.
It's Minneapolis.
Uh-huh.
And number
I
2...
would have thought Chicago.
Chicago is a top 10 city. Number 2 is St. Paul. I think New York City is...
So we have to live in Minnesota if we want to have a decent park?
No, New York City is number 7, so we're pretty good.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Out of 100. So, and New York City, 98% of us live within a 10-minute walk of a park because we have so many of those small... Thank you, Robert Moses. He took us from 100 playgrounds to 700 playgrounds in just a few years. Without him, New York City wouldn't have nearly the park system. It has all those great swimming pools, Riverside Park, Marine Park, Orchard Beach, and all the pools that we depend on were all built in the WPA.
You mentioned earlier that historically New York City has been a pioneer in creating parks. Doesn't that give us a higher ranking?
Well, but where we don't do as well as other park systems is on median park size. What could you take a wild guess as to what the median park size in New York is?
I know we have 3 or 4 huge ones. So we have Central Park, Prospect Park, we have Forest Park.
And Van Cortlandt, Greenbelt.
Riverside.
However, we've got about, say, depending on how you count the parks, at least 2,000 parks. So I'll tell you, the median park size in New York is 1 acre.
Wow.
Yeah, because we've got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these 1 acre and half-acre playgrounds, and those all count as parks.
So the total number of parks in the city is 2,263. So, and that includes playgrounds. Does it include the triangles in the middle of intersections and some the other small
Yes, if they
spaces?
are either parkland or assigned to the Parks Department, it counts those, yes.
There have been some recent controversies about parks or areas that are used as parks being turned over to developers. Isn't there a state law against alienation of parkland?
So here's the interesting part. There is no state law, and you won't find a law that protects parks in New York State or New York City. What there is judicial precedents. There is a series of court decisions that lead to something called the public trust doctrine. And the public trust doctrine has been interpreted by courts to mean that you cannot alienate parkland. That is, you cannot use it for a non-parks purpose unless you go through a 3-step process, which involves a local, what they call a home rule message, that is a city council or town council approving it, the state legislature approving it, and then, of course, the governor signing off on it, and then a replacement in kind of a park of equal size or value. Sometimes they'll count money toward that replacement. So there have been many, many lawsuits over the years, particularly in New York City, that have sort of created that policy. So it's a policy and a precedent, but not a law.
My guest on Leonard Lopate at Large here on WBAI New York 99.5 FM is Adrian Benepe, the former commissioner of New York City's Department of Parks and Recreation, currently senior vice president and director of city park development at the Trust for Public Land. Hasn't there been a dispute over whether a park called the Marx Brothers Playground on 2nd Avenue and 96th Street in East Harlem should be, that Avalon Bay should be allowed to develop put a building up there? They're going to put the tallest building, I gather, north of 60th Street all the way up to Boston.
Yes, it is quite controversial.
68-story tower? Something
like a 70-story tower in a place that's been a community park for more than 70 years. This goes back to about the mid-1940s when, of course, Robert Moses created it. And it's been a park there since the early 1940s. And it's particularly valuable because there are almost no parks in that part of the Upper East Side in East Harlem. And it's the only full-size playing field for a 5.5-mile stretch, going from 114th Street at Thomas Jefferson Park down to East River Park at 6th Street. So it's a highly congested, highly populated neighborhood with probably the least parkland per capita. And the city is giving this 1.5-acre site to Avalon Bay to develop a 70-story luxury tower. It's going to contain approximately 30% affordable housing, they say. But in a lot of people's views, this is illegal. This is an illegal taking away of parks, and there's a lot of complicated legal issues, but there are a number of organizations have sued to stop it from going forward, including the Municipal Art Society and New Yorkers for Parks and local civic organizations.
Isn't part of the dispute whether it's a playground or a park? What is there an easy distinction?
Well, because a playground is a park, so that's not really a dispute. The dispute has been somewhat mischaracterized in the press, and to put it in a nutshell, the city, I believe, tried to do a belt and suspenders approach. So they said it's not a park, therefore it has zoning. So parks don't have zoning. But it is a park, so we're going to take it through parkland alienation. They went through the parkland alienation procedures. The reason they did that is because about 15 years ago, when the MTA wanted to build the Second Avenue subway, they came to me and said, Parks Department, we need to borrow your park for a few years for staging to dig this tunnel. And I said to them, if you do that and it's more than 2 years, you're going to have to go through parkland alienation. You're going to have to go to Albany, you're going to have to get state and local approval, and you're going to have to give us $20 million to invest in local parks. And they did all of that.
No wonder that the queue line cost so much.
Well, it was the right thing to do because it is a park, and the city is now representing that they didn't have to do that. It was just done out of an abundance of caution. And I would represent, since I was in the middle of it, no, absolutely not. It was a park. It was run as a park. It says park on it. It's maintained by the Parks Department. The Parks Department invests the money in it. It is and always has been a park.
And who owns that land?
So the land is technically under the jurisdiction of the Department of Education. And so it's one of what they call a jointly operated playground that also goes back to Moses. Everything goes back to Moses. We could say and not be too biblical about it. Everything in New York in a park has some kind of Moses angle. So Robert Moses in the 1940s and 50s wanted to amp up the number of playgrounds. So he said, how can we maximize the playgrounds and parks? So every time he had an opportunity, he was building a highway, he'd put a park next to it. He put a tunnel over the railroad tracks and put Riverside Park on top of it. And in terms of neighborhood playgrounds, he recognized that schools would need schoolyards, and those could double as community parks after school. And so he created close to 300 what he called jointly operated playgrounds, intending them to stay as open space forever, but used by school during the day and community after school, weekends, and so on.
The mayor supports this building, and so does the speaker of the city council. Why are preservationists opposed?
Well, I think because, first of all, it's wrong and illegal and unethical, and also because they see that it's terrible to take away park and give it to a wealthy developer, and it's very much it's a legal slippery slope. If they view all of these playgrounds are part of the 10-minute. The reason New York City has such a good 10-minute walk score is because all of these playgrounds count. If suddenly they're viewed as developable sites, we start to drop off, and you could have hundreds of thousands of people not having a neighborhood playground like the kinds that you grew up with.
So we would be, in effect, giving Avalon Bay this property?
Yes.
1.5 acres?
Yes. The plan is to replace the park in between two tall buildings in the middle of the block, but I've never seen a park that works next to a 70-story building. They don't exist in New York City because it would be a terrible thing. It would be in shade and wind the entire time.
And I know from my own experience, when I see a park next to a big building, I always assume that it's really attached to the building and not available to the general public.
You won't find anywhere in New York a playground that's literally underneath a 70-story building. And as you remember, in the late lamented World Trade Center, those plazas next to them were awful spaces, windy, shaded, awful spaces. So it's kind of outrageous that the city is doing this.
Talking about the World Trade Center, the oldest park in the city is Bowling Green, which was created in 1733.
Yes, sir.
That's before the United States existed. How did that come about?
It goes back to the concept of the town green. Every town in the old world had a town green where you tethered your goats and your sheep, and you did lawn bowling and things like that. It was some kind of a sale where they sold it for 3 peppercorns to the city, and it was the bowling green where you did bowling, and it was where you might have your livestock headed there, and became the city's first park. It's not the oldest park in America. That's probably the Boston Common.
I did say the oldest in the city.
It's the oldest in the city for sure.
But it's worth a lot more than 3 peppercorns these days.
These days it would be, yes.
When was the Parks Department established, and what was its mandate?
So the unified, it goes back to Moses, the unified New York City Parks Department was created in January of 1934 when Moses assumed.
I hope Robert Caro's not listening to this.
He is, and Caro, to his credit, does make the case that Moses was great for parks. He's got a chapter called 1 Year about all the things that were done in just 1 year. And he does give credit to Moses for his park things, creating the Central Park Zoo and the Prospect Park Zoo in about 6 months, building the 13 amazing WPA pools.
And that was all done during the Depression
in the
to
depths
generate
of the Great
jobs?
Depression, yes. So Moses was masterful at getting his hands on federal money. So the Works Progress Administration, WPA, and the PWA, Public Works Administration, he was extremely adept at snatching up that money and using it for parks. And 80 years later, we're still living off that legacy.
So all the other parks that were created after New York became a city were done on their own? There was no Parks Commission?
There was a Parks Commission, not for New York City, but for each borough. So there was a Brooklyn Parks Department, there was a Manhattan Parks Department, or something of that name. And it was only in 1898 that you had the unified city, as you know, and then there were still independent parks departments until 1934.
And there were scandals along the way. The creation of Central Park meant throwing an awful lot of people off the land, the opposite of the Avalon Bay project.
They
mostly poor people and mostly people of color.
They used eminent domain in those days. So eminent domain is not new. It goes back to probably before Central Park, but they said, we want to create a park. They didn't throw people. They bought the land from the people, but they said, you don't have a choice. They said, we're going to give you this money. You have to leave. So the recent discoveries about Seneca Village, that was near where the American Museum of Natural History is, was that it was probably a mixed-race town of African Americans and other European origin people living together in a small town. But it was one of the, back in those days, New York City was below 14th Street. You had the village of Harlem, the village of Bloomingdale, and all these little villages up in the upper reaches of Inwood, up in Upper Manhattan, and the Seneca Village was one of those small villages that predated the park.
One of the oddest proposals for Central Park was Frank Lloyd Wright's proposal to build 2 mile-high buildings on it. Were you aware of that? Pretty much all New York's residents could live in one of them, and all of the businesses could be in people who want to rent apartments, and then the rest of the city could be devoted to small houses.
That's the radiant city taken to a grotesque extreme. I've heard of a lot of bizarre proposals for Central Park over the years, some of which almost happened.
I probably got that wrong.
But
Somebody's going to write me.
It could be.
But
right.
I think there's something. It's kind of what happened.
It was even proposed to build public housing in the north end of Central Park. Luckily, that didn't happen. But there were all kinds of proposals for giant memorials. There was somebody who wanted to build an airfield in Central Park. Because the problem is people look at parks as developable space, and that's the problem in a microcosm at Marx Brothers Playground. They look around and say they don't want to go through the effort and expense of in a crowded city. You're going to pay a lot of money to acquire land. And so the cheap, easy, and unethical way is to take parks and view them as development sites.
And in the case of Central Park, it is very valuable land. It
sure is
one of the most prized parts of the city.
What's the cost per acre? $30 million? If you were trying to recreate that park now.
Do we have any national parks or state parks in the city?
Oh, we sure do. Gateway National Recreation Area is a big national park. Statue of Liberty, Ellis Island, Grant's Tomb. There are all kinds of national monuments, national parks. There are about 16,000 acres of national park land in New York City, and that counts in our park score. And then there are state parks.
And we're still just number 7.
Well, we should be proud to be number 7 out of 100. So we've got state parks, the North River State Park, which is the park on top of the sewage treatment plant. There's parks along the East River in Brooklyn. There's parks in Staten Island. And the newest state park, which was just announced by Governor Cuomo, and it's a pretty big deal, they're taking the Franklin and Pennsylvania Avenue landfills in South Brooklyn and turning those into parks.
What's the process for creating a new park in this city? Does the Parks Department look into which neighborhoods have less green space and see if there's city-owned land there that could be turned into a park?
You know, it's been a little, I would say, including in my day, it's been sort of entrepreneurial and opportunistic as opposed to purposeful. Because the trouble with trying to create new parks in crowded neighborhoods is there's no room to create the new park. So that's why you get things like the High Line. It's the adaptive reuse of abandoned space, abandoned technology, abandoned infrastructure. It's brownfields. So if you think about all the big new parks that have been created in the last 20 years in New York, the Hudson River and Hudson River Park and Brooklyn Bridge Park, abandoned pier structures. So former maritime industry no longer there. The High Line and abandoned railroad line, the parks along the Bronx River, abandoned industrial sites. So there isn't like primeval forest awaiting the creation of parks out there. The last opportunity we had for acquiring lots of land for parks was in Staten Island and Jamaica Bay.
But there are abandoned buildings and abandoned and empty lots.
They are abandoned, but they're not available without paying lots of money. That's the problem. So, and I'll give you a perfect example. When the city committed to building parks along Greenpoint and Williamsburg in exchange for a lot of development along the waterfront, we identified a number of sites, including a site up in Williamsburg. And we thought at the time we'd be paying what it would cost to buy someone's warehouse. Well, the courts decided that the seller could charge as if he could build a 40-story tower there, even though he couldn't and never would be able to. So it kind of quintupled the price. So that's why the city has been forced to pay $300 million to buy the waterfront property. And to their credit, to Mayor de Blasio's credit, he kept the commitment that had been made by Mayor Bloomberg to buy that property and create that waterfront park, even though it's this astounding cost of land acquisition. So that's why you don't do it, because it's $300 million for a few acres.
Actually, $374 million. But
that's the other park in Hudson Yards.
Well, we'll get to those.
That's not city money. It's a lot of money, but it's not city money.
So can a local community board or a city council member make a request for a certain district? Yes,
they can. In fact, a recent example of that, and I think was in Corey Johnson's district, who's now the speaker, there was a city-owned lot on West 20th Street. And that's a very park-deprived neighborhood. There are almost no parks in that part of the city. And the community said, can we turn it into a park? And the sanitation department owned it. They were parking trucks there. And at first there was objection, and then he prevailed. And they're now building a small 1-acre park on West 20th Street.
In the case of a major new development like Hudson Yards, is there a requirement that some public space must be part of the mix?
Yes, that was a requirement. And so you already have some parks in Hudson Yards, and this is the continuation of that. And so, while it's a lot of money, all of you won't see that money because it's all below surface. They have to build a giant platform over the rail yards. It's enormously complicated. So I don't think it's a bad thing what they're doing there, because you have an enormous new community with tens of thousands of new residents and office workers, and you need to have some public space.
We're talking about parks with Adrian Bennett, Senior Vice President and Director of the City Park Development at the Trust for Public Land. And we've been circling around the matter of the Hudson Yards Park. Where's it located?
I don't have the in-depth knowledge here, so I may be wrong. I believe it's the part of the new development that's either north or south of 34th Street. So in the general vicinity, the Hudson Yards are basically south of 34th Street. And they're building many, many very tall towers there. And the money will come from the developers, not from the city.
This is all, to some degree, from the fallout from the High Line, because we've seen the meatpacking district change totally, and pretty much everything all along the route of the High Line up to 34th Street.
Yeah, but
we even have a subway station.
The Hudson Yards has long been envisioned as a development. It may even precede Mayor Bloomberg because you had this big empty space with just trains being stored there, and they thought, what if we could do a development on top of it and actually get some offices next to the convention center? Remember, the convention center used to be way out in Lonelyville, and now there's a giant city. There's the equivalent of a city growing up around it now.
Am I wrong? At one point, wasn't Donald Trump involved in talks about developing this area? Or was that another part of
That was another part. That was another set of yards. That's up on the Upper West Side, what's now Riverside Park South. And it used to be called something with the name of Trump. The Trump name is no longer associated with it.
It's been reported that the Hudson Yards Park will cost $374 million to expand it by just 3 blocks. Why would it cost so much? That's
Because
over $100 million a block.
You have to remember that it's all on top of a platform, on top of a train yard, so that it's an extraordinary infrastructure project. So I would imagine 90% of that you'll never see, because it's about the platform once it's built. It's about moving around the drain lines, the power lines, and everything. And then it might be, out of the $374 million, there might be $20 million above ground. It'll probably be a really nice park.
Wouldn't it be cheaper just to dig up the train tracks and do it on the ground?
Well, no, because then you wouldn't be able to have Amtrak or Metro North or any of the other trains that go through there.
So where does most of that money come from?
That money is coming, and forgive me, I don't know the details. I believe that the developers are issuing bonds, so that ultimately it's not city capital dollars.
But the land doesn't belong to the city, or it does belong to the city?
Technically speaking, that land probably belonged at some point to probably Penn Central Railroad, or now the MTA probably, and Amtrak. So it's probably a really complicated deal.
Because MTA is part state, part city.
Yeah, so I can't tell you what the ownership is. I was only tangentially involved. And will the parks actually be mapped as parkland or not? I don't actually know the answer to that question.
Are most new parks created on land that the city already owns?
Most, but not all. So, for example...
I did use the word most.
Yes, the High Line, the city didn't own. It was owned by CSX Railroad. And the CSX, to their eternal credit, gave it to the city for $1. And they could have charged millions of dollars because it's extremely valuable. And it's awfully complicated because private property owners own the rights to develop underneath it and around it and on top of it, depending on the very complicated Byzantine land sales around there.
The Hudson Yards project is huge, and it's going to bring many more people into the area. Is having more open space there a necessity because of that?
Absolutely. And again, I go back to the Trust for Public Lands mantra that you can't have a great city without great parks, and a lot of parks, and that everybody deserves a park within a 10-minute walk. And I would say that an enormous part of New York City's revival and success as a city is its great park system, and that everything flows from that. It's not just that you live on Fifth Avenue or Central Park West and have a great view and are willing to pay for that. It's that parks are where we go to get exercise. The trees in parks give us oxygen and absorb our waste products, like carbon dioxide and the particulate matter. New York City would be completely unlivable without its parks.
Where did the zoning laws come into this story?
That is a great question. So as I mentioned before, parks don't have zoning, so you don't say this park is an R6 and this park is a M12. Parks are zoned as parks. If you look at a zoning map, you'll see it says parks on it. And there are a lot of things that are not mapped as parks that are under the park's jurisdiction. So if you think about the Park Avenue malls or the Broadway malls, those are technically DOT properties, but they've been under the Parks Department's jurisdictions for more than 100 years.
And those malls count as parks?
They do.
You can't walk along them.
You can.
You take your life.
Some of them you can in Harlem, but you can sit on a bench, particularly on the Broadway malls. I've always been
You mean on the corner?
On the corners, yeah. I've always loved the fact that you walk up Broadway and you see people just sitting in the middle of 4 lanes of traffic.
Yesterday we talked about the problems of idling vehicles. I'm not so sure I want to sit there, considering what I know now about all the pollution.
I think New Yorkers have breathed in bad air for so long they're immune.
We mentioned that since the High Line opened in 2009, it's become a popular tourist destination, but also luxury residential buildings have been built all along it. Does that popularity translate into revenue for the city?
Yes, in a very major way. So parks have have a profound economic impact. And there have been a number of studies that show at least a 15% increase in the property value next to a park. And now that's a double-edged sword because
So taxes go up.
taxes go up. So all kinds of taxes. So if you have, say the High Line, which had mostly industrial buildings next to it, there wasn't a lot of displacement involved in that because it was mostly industrial buildings that were converted to lofts, and then some very high-end luxury residential and office buildings have built around it. But somewhere around 40 new buildings have gone up, and the last I heard, somewhere between $2 and $4 billion in economic activity created by that. So there's all of the taxes and all of the jobs created, and the people who have the jobs paying taxes and the unincorporated business taxes. So it's a huge boon. That's a giant boon to New York. And people say, well, that's not right. It's like, except it's paying a lot of the salaries of city workers, cops and firefighters and teachers.
Brooklyn Bridge Park is another recent addition to the city's green space. Did we own that land?
That land was owned by the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. So it's largely
This is
under
getting
the
more and
state.
more complicated.
It was enormous. That's why the state of New York and the city of... So the state was the lead there because the 80 acres that became Brooklyn Bridge Park were largely under the Port Authority and was used for many, many years for shipping.
How much did it cost?
That's $500 million and counting, and they haven't quite finished it. And all of that is public money from the state and the city.
In that case, there are a number of these parks are in areas that already have wealthier people living there. Chelsea, Brooklyn Heights. How likely is a park in a poorer neighborhood to get the kind of funding that these parks have gotten?
I'd say
does the city have a budget for
it does.
creating new parks?
It doesn't have a budget specifically for creating new parks. They appropriate capital dollars. Either the mayor or the city council would do that. So when I was working for Mayor Bloomberg, we had as part of Plan YC, we had $400 million set aside to develop new parks in underserved areas. So we did a park in Far Rockaway. We did parks in the South Bronx. So yes, the city has and will invest, and to its credit, the de Blasio administration is investing in about $300 million in fixing up approximately 75 playgrounds, largely in underserved areas, and about $150 million in 5 what they call anchor parks.
There's disagreement over whether commercial development should be allowed within parks like restaurants or hotels. Where does the city stand on that? Because there are restaurants already in
Yes.
Union Square, Central Park, and then other kinds of concessions in many parks. Are there laws that regulate this commercial activity?
Yeah, so there have been restaurants in parks since parks existed. If you go back to the creation and the design of Central Park in the 1850s, they designed restaurants into it. So there was an old building called the Casino, which Moses tore down, the Mineral Springs Pavilion. So, serving food in parks is not a bad thing. It's nice to be able to have something to eat, whether it's a snack bar or a sit-down restaurant. And the courts have sided again and again with the city that there's nothing wrong with having a restaurant. The reason there are hotels and apartments in, quote unquote, in Brooklyn Bridge Park was because that wasn't a park. It was, property owned by the state used for the purpose of commerce. And in creating the park, they said, we're going to invest untold amounts of public money in building this park. We can't afford to maintain it, so we want to create some revenue-producing nodes. So before it became a park, they set aside 10% of the park footprint to build hotels in and to have some residential towers because they knew, precisely because they knew, that's the only thing that's guaranteed revenue.
What about Barry Diller's controversial Pier 55 project? Can you give us a brief rundown of its history?
So that's Barry Diller's company, IAC, is in that beautiful building across the street from near where Pier 55 will be. As Hudson River Park was developed, they said that you could continue to replace the piers and put park activities there. And there were 2 piers, Pier 54 and Pier 56, which were both falling down. So the Hudson River Park Trust reached out to Barry Diller. He didn't reach out to them and said, can you help us build a new pier to replace those piers? So it's perfectly legal. And to his eternal credit, he's going to put about $200 million into building a public park, which the city and state were not ready to ante up.
Haven't lawsuits been brought against it? What are the arguments?
They've all been settled.
The courts ruled for Diller?
No, they're just the litigants that said we're not going to sue anymore, and the courts did rule not for Diller but for Hudson River Park.
And has construction resumed?
Yeah, oh yeah, it's well under construction. I think it's great because, it's a civic-minded person who's made a lot of money saying, I want to give something great back to the city.
When it's finished, will it be under the purview of the New York City Parks Department?
It'll be under the purview of the Hudson River Park Trust, which is a governmental agency.
Now, Elizabeth Street Gardens has been the focus of a fierce fight between local residents and the city, which has sold it to a developer for an affordable housing project. Why isn't a garden considered a park?
I love the Elizabeth Street Garden. I discovered it only in the last 5 or 6 years, and it has not been a park. It's it's publicly owned land. It was part of a school construction. It was never served as a park, and it was being used by an adjacent business to store sort of old monuments and things. And then gradually it became used as a park, as a de facto park, not a de jure park. But it's in a neighborhood which has almost no parks. That neighborhood is completely bereft of parks, and it became this lovely sort of alternative open space. And I don't think that housing and parks are an either-or proposition. I think it's both and. You need both affordable housing and parks, and the city has a terrific opportunity to build 3 times as much affordable housing on a piece of land they own up in the West Village. And it's still the same basic community, and they could save this beautiful 1-acre open space on Elizabeth Street and build the affordable housing elsewhere.
That's in Elizabeth Street is in the area north of Chinatown?
Yes. Yeah. Some people call it Nolita, but it's an area
There are no parks there at all.
No parks at all. There's a couple of tiny little sort of quarter-acre playgrounds. But so there are, interestingly, and you sort of raised the point that poor neighborhoods are less well served by parks
like
than
the Lower
wealthy
East Side,
neighborhoods.
for example.
But it turns out that on a national level, and we've mapped every single park in America. We just finished this 3-year project to map every single park in every community in America, 14,000 communities. Turns out there's slightly better access to parks for poor people than wealthy people because in most cities, not New York, the wealthy people tend to be concentrated in the outer suburbs where they don't really have parks. It doesn't
But
mean
they own their own property.
Yeah,
they
but
tend to have
a backyard a backyard is just not a park. But just because you have access to a park doesn't mean it's a good, safe, or clean park. So there's a big question of equity in parks, which we think is really important.
Adrian Benepe is my guest on Leonard Lopate at Large on WBAI New York 99.5 FM. Community gardens are another area of controversy. There are some 600 of them in all boroughs. Weren't many of them started in the 1970s when the city was bankrupt and landlords were fleeing? So they have functioned as green spaces, valuable green spaces in many areas that didn't have parks.
Yeah, so it's a long and complicated history. Do we have a couple of shows to go over this?
Actually, we only have about less than 10 minutes.
I'll try to make it really fast. So there were hundreds of community gardens in properties that were owned in rem by the city, that is seized for failure to pay taxes. Now, the understanding always was that if the city needed the property for some other purpose, the garden would have to go away. When land started to become valuable again, the Giuliani administration attempted to sell about 120 of these gardens. A lawsuit was filed by the Attorney General, and then 2 organizations stepped in to purchase 120 of these gardens. It was the Trust for Public Land and then Bette Midler's group, New York Restoration Project. So we saved 120 of those gardens. We created Urban Land Trust to manage them. And then under Mayor Bloomberg, we settled that lawsuit. And it was brought by Attorney General Spitzer, I believe. We settled the lawsuit, and we agreed to preserve several hundred gardens permanently, subject to their being taken care of. I am concerned now. I have heard that the city wants to will no longer indemnify and hold harmless the volunteer garden operators and require them to carry insurance. They don't have money to pay insurance. It would be a penny-wise and pound-foolish thing for the city to do.
Bette Midler's organization is buying that land. So that's her way of helping out the city?
They bought the parks, and they bought the gardens, they saved them, they own them, and they're run by local neighborhood organizations.
The gardens are administered by Green Thumb, which is part of the Parks Department. But
Yes.
on some city maps, they're classified as vacant lots. So when are they parks and when are they vacant lots?
Few of them are actually mapped as parkland. So they may retain the ownership of Housing Preservation and Development or Department of Citywide Administrative Services, but they're assigned to the Parks Department by a letter. So city agencies can simply swap land and say, hey, you take care of this for us for now.
The question, I guess, for an outsider is, since most of them have been built and maintained by neighborhood residents at no cost to the city, why not just say, okay, these are really wonderful things that people have brought to their neighborhoods?
I think the city's posture is pretty much supportive of these things, and we do have a legal agreement that requires these gardens to stay there in perpetuity, assuming that someone's there to maintain them. Like if the garden groups walk, there's even a protocol for if the gardening group walks away, you find another gardening group. So I'm not really worried about the preservation of most of the community gardens, though some of them were deemed as part of the settlement subject to development. So that, and I think you really have to say, look, we agreed to that legally. Yeah, so there's a handful of gardens that could be developed, but that'll still leave about 500, 600 gardens.
The Boardwalk Community Garden in Coney Island was bulldozed to create an amphitheater. Why was that allowed to happen?
That was one of the gardens that was subject to development. And so they protected lots and lots of community gardens, but there are probably several score that were not legally protected. And, considering that there are 600 gardens, that's pretty good. Most cities doesn't have it.
How can people in the city get involved, either in getting a new park built in their neighborhoods or improving the ones that already exist?
Well, I'll just do one product placement. The Trust for Public Land is helping to create.
That's your organization.
That's our organization. We actually are building parks across the city. We're taking these asphalt schoolyards and turning them into green community playgrounds that capture stormwater. And we're about to do number 200. This fall, we'll do our 200th playground. And what we do is we bring private resources and match it with public money. We do a community design thing with the school kids and turn them from, you and I grew up playing on sheets of asphalt surrounded by fences. They had all the charm of a concentration camp. And we're making them green. We're putting play equipment. The New York Roadrunners pay us to put in running tracks and do running programs. So what you can do is, A, participate, go to your community board, advocate for parks, support New Yorkers for Parks in their drive to get an adequate budget for Commissioner Silver, and also give money to your local parks group, to your Friends of Group, to conservancies. Conservancies like the Prospect Park Alliance and the Bronx River Alliance need donations to keep going.
Go to community board meetings?
Yes, because they
bug your council member?
Absolutely. The squeaky wheel gets the grease.
Another problem is that some of the things, the new parks, the things that they put in these parks have been subject to controversy. Who controls that? Some of the things have been considered even dangerous for kids.
You mean like play equipment and stuff like that?
So equipment.
Ultimately, the control is.
I mean, it used to be monkey bars, which weren't exactly the safest things in the world.
People complain that parks are too safe. There are all kinds of standards you have to adhere to when you design playgrounds because people are worried about being sued. And so there's a whole new movement about having dangerous playgrounds for kids where kids can play with dangerous things. Because otherwise, how do you learn about danger and not danger?
New York, as you point out, is number 7 in terms of rankings in parks. So how do we rank in terms of the way we deal with parks? Are there cities where there is more of an attempt to create parks? Or are there others where there's a certain resistance to creating parks?
I think we do pretty well across the board. I'm a little worried that we're starting to lose our moxie. There are no new parks on the drawing board, and we're going to add 500,000 people.
There are no new parks.
There are no new parks being planned right now. We have an idea to build the High Line of Queens. It's called the Queensway in Central Queens. It's a 3.5-mile abandoned rail line that we want to turn into a linear park and greenway. And City Hall just isn't. They haven't said yes. Go ahead. They haven't said no, but they haven't said yes. And it's been 6 years of maybe yes, maybe no.
Some old railroad bridges have been turned into pedestrian walks. Are they considered parks?
Well, the High Line is mapped as a park now. I don't know.
I think there's one over the.
I don't know
Harlem
about
River.
the one. The one over the Harlem River is also a park. That's the High Bridge. That was part. It was not a railroad bridge, but it was part of the Croton Aqueduct system.
Oh, right. And in Europe, you see aqueducts turned into parks all over.
Well, Europe has a 2,000-year head start on us, at least in terms of cities.
And have you compared European parks to?
We haven't done any ranking for European cities. But what's interesting is that in most European cities, the first parks were all royal pleasure grounds, and then became open to the public after the various kings and queens got beheaded. We didn't have to do that here. So the public park tradition is a very American thing. Europe caught up, and of course Paris and London have great park systems, but most of the great parks of London started as royal property.
In just a few minutes we have left, you had dealings with Donald Trump while you were Parks Commissioner. Did he got involved with the Woolman Rink, didn't he?
Yes. So so early on, when I was the press secretary for Commissioner Stern under Mayor Koch, I was there when he came in and said, "Hey, you guys have really screwed up." I didn't say one of those words. Have really screwed up this Woolman Rink project. Let me come in and do it. And Mayor Koch agreed reluctantly to it. And he finished up the last stages there. And to his credit, he did a good job. Where I most recently got involved with him when I was with Parks Commissioner, and we brought the Trump organization on to run the Ferry Point Golf Course after we finished building it. And which was fine. At the time, he wasn't running for president, and he was successful at running golf courses, except when the course finally opened, he claimed to have built it, which was a easily disprovable lie. And that's when I learned that, why would you lie about something which is so easily disprovable? And that it was during the campaign I was quoted as saying it was a pants on fire lie.
Is he a unique case, or have you run into similar things?
Oh no, he's absolutely unique. I don't think I've ever seen, and since then we've all learned, and the Washington Post has documented, that he lies about everything, and it's extraordinary. And everybody else is held to some level of truthfulness, but the President of the United States is not. It blows my mind.
Are you amused at the fact that any number of tenants who have lived in buildings that had the Trump name on them have sued to have the name taken off? Is that going to happen with the golf course?
Unfortunately, there's nothing amusing about Trump. It's just. Let me not go there.
No,
I'm not
okay.
amused by it.
Yeah. Does this apply to parks in other parts of the country? Because he has golf courses.
The golf courses are mostly privately owned. So, and he didn't build this. He doesn't own it. The Trump organization is managing it. Look, I think they're doing a good job managing it. We couldn't, and it was their offer was the best offer after 3 attempts to find someone to run this golf. So, all the city golf courses are run by private operators, and they pay us money, which is good. So they run them well, and they pay rent to the city.
The Bronx has one of the most impressive ones.
So we've got, there are now 5 golf courses in the Bronx. It's extraordinary. And again, they go back to Moses.
Oh, I'm getting a whole new sense of Robert Moses as
he really was a great person for the park system. You can argue about the other stuff he did, but I don't think anybody would make the case that he didn't do miraculous things for New York City parks.
And you've been pretty good for our park system as well.
I always pinch myself. I can't believe I had that job. It's kind of a dream job. And my wife reminds me that every once in a while, that long ago she said to me when I was a park ranger in Central Park, so what are you going to do when you grow up? And she said, and I don't remember this, I said, well, being Parks Commissioner would be cool.
Adrian Benepe, it was the Commissioner of New York City Department of Parks and Recreation for 11 years. Currently, he is the Senior Vice President and Director of City Park Development at the Trust for Public Land. Thank you so much for being on our show today.
This hour has flown by. It feels like 10 minutes, Leonard. What a pleasure.
And that brings us to the end of our show today. My great thanks to Adrian Benepe, to Barbara Kahn, who produced this segment, to Charlie Morrow, who composed our theme music, to Reggie Johnson, who was at the audio controls, and to my assistant producer, Jesse Lind, who makes things run smoothly. Leonard Lopate at Large comes to you on Saturdays at 4 and Tuesdays at noon. You can subscribe to Leonard Lopate at Large podcast on iTunes and by clicking on Robin Hood Radio's archive program site, which is robinhoodradio.com. You can also check out Leonard Lopate at Large Facebook page. We hope to see you next week.